You are inside the palace archive. Baghdad. February 1258. The siege has lasted 18 days and the outer wall is still standing. You know this because you checked 20 minutes ago. And yet, there are boots on the marble floor of the inner courtyard, moving calmly, moving with purpose, moving toward you. They are not heading for the gold. That is what history never told you. He did not run. That is the first thing worth understanding about this man, a senior palace scribe, middle-aged, ink permanently embedded in the creases of his fingers. He did not run when he heard them coming. Instead, he opened the nearest daybook, picked up his quill, and began writing names. Every name he could remember. Every visitor. Every record. As fast as his hand would move. Then a hand, not his own, reached over his shoulder and drew a single line through what he had just written. He did not turn around. The outer wall of Baghdad was intact. No alarm had been called, no breach announced. And yet men he had never seen were already moving through the inner garden with the unhurried deliberateness of people who had studied a map of this place long before they arrived. They passed the treasury without slowing. They passed the weapon stores. They passed the great ceremonial hall, its doors still sealed. Their first stop was the archive. This was not chaos. This was choreography. The scribe moved through corridors that felt wrong. Not damaged, reorganised. The map room, open, its contents being sorted by category. The correspondence archive, open, two men working through it in silence. The room housing 40 years of the Caliph's private visitor records, open, a third-man cross referencing entries against a separate document the scribe had never seen. The treasury, still sealed. The armoury, still sealed. The Caliph's personal apartments, sealed. He found a senior court official in the Eastern Passage, a man of genuine authority, someone the scribe had addressed formally for 20 years. The official was calm in a way that felt practiced. He explained, quietly, that this was a negotiated arrangement, that the Caliph had agreed to certain terms, that specific materials were being handed over as part of a settlement. The scribe should return to his desk. Everything was accounted for. Everything was under control. The official was carrying a document, a list, room numbers and names, written in a script the scribe could not identify. The rooms on the list were the rooms being opened. If you've ever wondered why the version of history you learned in school feels like it's missing entire chapters, like the official story was assembled by the people with the most to gain, this channel exists for exactly that reason. Subscribe and stay with us. The scribe went back to his desk. The daybook was still open, the crossed-out name still wet. He looked at it carefully. He knew this person. A minor official, someone who had left Baghdad 6 weeks ago. He had watched them leave. He had recorded their departure in this same book. So why was their name in this morning's visitor log? Not their travel record. Not a reference. A fresh entry, written in standard administrative ink, in standard administrative script, as if they had simply walked through the palace gates that morning and signed in. The scribe read the name again. Then he looked at the line drawn through it, drawn before the ink beneath it had fully dried. Someone had crossed out a visitor who could not have been there, and they had done it before the record was even finished. Here is what the standard history gives you. Hulagu Khan's forces encircled Baghdad on the 20th of January 1258. The Caliph al-Mustasim, last of the Abbasid line, commander of the faithful, heir to 5 centuries of Islamic imperial authority, refused to negotiate. 18 days later, the walls came down. The city fell. The Golden Age ended. That account is not wrong, exactly. It is simply missing the 6 hours that matter most. Every major chronicle of the siege, Mongol commissioned, Abbasid, Persian, independent, records activity before the breach and activity after it. Military movements, casualty figures, administrative orders. The record on both sides is detailed, often granular. But the specific hour the walls came down, the name of the first soldier through, the account of the breach itself, absent, in every source, simultaneously. For the defining military event of the 13th century, the destruction of the world's most sophisticated city, the symbolic end of an empire that had stood for 500 years. Not one chronicle records the moment it actually happened. Contemporary scholars have noted this gap and largely set it aside, attributing it to the chaos of battle, the unreliability of sources, the inevitable losses of transmission. That explanation is reasonable. It is also convenient. Consider what Rashid al-Din Hamadani chose to emphasize in his Jami al-Tawarikh, the Compendium of Chronicles, commissioned by the Mongols themselves, written explicitly to document and glorify their conquests. In that text, the military assault on Baghdad occupies a fraction of the available pages. The administrative transfer of palace records, what was catalogued, how it was organised, where specific categories of document were directed, receives 3 times the attention. In a document designed to celebrate military power, the battle is almost an afterthought. The paperwork is the headline.
And then there is this, at least 3 chronicles, written independently in 3 separate cities by authors with no documented connection to one another, all describe the first Mongol movements inside the walls in strikingly similar terms. Not violent, not frantic, calm, targeted, purposeful. Most historians have read this as poetic license, a rhetorical device, scribal shorthand for disciplined troops, the possibility that it was simply accurate, that the first men inside were not soldiers acting on instinct, but agents operating from a prepared list, has received considerably less attention. Which returns us to the question the scribe was already asking, alone at his desk, looking at a crossed-out name that should not have existed. Who wrote the list? And who, already inside the palace, had helped prepare it? 3 weeks after the official date of Baghdad's fall, a cloth merchant on the western bank of the Tigris was haggling over the price of dyed fabric. His market was open. His neighbours were present. He had heard, through fragments of rumour, that the Eastern Palace district had fallen. But no soldier had appeared on his street. No order had reached his quarter. The city, where he stood, was simply continuing. This is not a dramatic device. Chronicle sources document it as historical reality, significant portions of Baghdad, entire quarters, active markets, functioning neighbourhoods, continued operating for weeks after the conquest's official date. In a city of perhaps 1 million people, the information had been severed so completely that vast sections of the population did not yet know their world had ended. The merchant's unease arrived not in a single blow, but in accumulation. Rumours with no source. Neighbours who had gone east to look and not returned. A specific detail, overheard at the spice stalls, one neighbourhood on the eastern bank had never been entered at all. Soldiers had moved around it, carefully, as if avoiding it by design. A man nearby said it quietly, almost to himself. They know what they want. They're not in a hurry. That evening the merchant found a folded paper beneath his door. A list of names, most of them strangers to him. His own name was on it. At the bottom, in a different hand, a single instruction: do not be at your shop on Thursday. He did not know who had written it. He did not know what would happen on Thursday. He only knew that whoever was moving through what remained of Baghdad was still keeping records, and had decided he was worth tracking. Here is what the palace daybooks actually show, when you read them carefully enough to notice what should not be there. The books survive in fragmentary form, Persian administrative archives, scattered collections, partial copies made before the originals deteriorated. Scholars examining them through the 20th century catalogue the visitor logs for the final weeks of the Caliphate, names, dates, the bureaucratic notation of who entered the palace and when. Standard administrative record-keeping, unremarkable at first glance. Some names are crossed through, some are not, and several of the uncrossed names, entries made in the final days before and after the conquest, recorded as legitimate palace visitors, belong to people who, according to other surviving documents from the same period, were dead, or were located hundreds of miles from Baghdad. One name in the log corresponds to a minor official whose obituary is preserved in a separate biographical register, recording his death from fever 14 months before the date of his supposed visit. The obituary exists. The visitor entry exists. Both are written in the same administrative script. Both appear to be genuine records. Either the daybooks were fabricated wholesale, which raises the question of why, and by whom, or the names recorded were not the names of the actual visitors. Someone, or several people, were entering the palace and being logged under identities that could not withstand scrutiny, false names drawn from the roster of the already dead. The Caliph al-Mustasim, in this reading, was not isolated. He was not sitting in helpless silence, awaiting a Mongol verdict. He was meeting with people, and whoever those people actually were, someone had taken considerable care to ensure the record of their presence would be both undeniable and untraceable. Then there is the scholar, a researcher working in the latter half of the 20th century who identified the pattern of impossible names and began cross-referencing the daybook entries against other archival sources, obituaries, travel records, court registers, attempting to map the discrepancy systematically. He did not complete the work. His research notes were cited in 2 subsequent academic papers. Those papers can be located. The notes themselves cannot be found in any archive, any collection, any catalogue in the world. This may be coincidence. Libraries lose things. Scholars die before finishing. The absence of a document is not, by itself, evidence of anything. But the pattern accumulates. The crossed-out names are not uniform. This is the detail that requires attention. Forensic examination of the surviving daybook fragments, conducted by researchers working from photographic reproductions, established that the ink used in the strike-throughs is not consistent across the document. Some names were crossed out with ink matching the surrounding text exactly, same shade, same composition, applied at the same sitting by the same hand. Those erasures happened in the moment of writing. Others were struck through with ink of immeasurably different oxidation, applied later by a different person, returning to records that had already been completed, signed, and filed. 2 separate operations, one in real time, one retrospective. And the retrospective erasures are densest in precisely the period the record most needs to be clear, the final days of the Caliphate, the hours surrounding the conquest, the administrative window that history has never fully accounted for. Persian chancery law required that all corrections to official records be initialed by the correcting official. It was not a suggestion. It was administrative statute embedded in the bureaucratic culture that had governed these institutions for generations. The retrospective ink strikes in the daybooks carry no initials, not a single one. Whoever returned to those completed records to cross out those names was deliberately operating outside the law, which means they understood the law well enough to know exactly what they were violating. One name on the final surviving daybook page is struck through so heavily the underlying text is illegible, but on the reverse side of the page, where the ink bled through the parchment, a faint impression survives. Scholars have identified 3 possible letter combinations in that impression. One of them corresponds to a senior Abbasid administrative official who, according to every other surviving source, died defending the city. By the 3rd day after the official fall, the scribe had begun to understand something about his own continued presence. He was still at his desk, still being handed documents to log, still being instructed by men he did not recognize to record transfers he was not permitted to question. He had expected by now to have been removed, relocated, detained, replaced. Instead, he was being used. And the specific way he was being used told him something important about what was actually happening in the palace around him. On the morning of the 3rd day, he was called to record a transfer. An object he was given no description, no category, no indication of size or material, had been removed from a house adjacent to the palace complex, a minor household. The administrative record of that property listed no one of political significance, no military affiliation, no connection to the caliph's court that the scribe could identify. An ordinary address, unremarkable in 40 years of palace records. He was handed a directive and instructed to copy its contents into the daybook verbatim. He wrote the name of the house. He wrote the notation for the transferred item, simply, object removed. He wrote the administrative directive number, and he wrote the destination. Then he stopped. He read the destination again. He did not recognize it. Not as a city, not as a regional administrative designation, not as a military outpost or a way station on any route he knew. He consulted a colleague, a man who had worked palace logistics for longer than the scribe had held his current position. The colleague did not recognize it either. They pulled the master geographic registry from its shelf, the comprehensive catalogue of every named location within Abbasid administrative reach. The destination was not in it. The directive number offered no further clarity. It followed the correct sequential format for Mongol administrative orders. The structure was authentic, the notation precise, the official markings indistinguishable from legitimate documents the scribe had processed in the days prior. But Mongol administrative scholars had established, by cross-referencing known records, that the specific numerical sequence containing this directive number was never actually used in Mongol administrative practice. The format was real, the number was invented. Someone had constructed a convincing document that pointed, with bureaucratic confidence, to a place that did not exist. The scribe sat for a long moment with what he had written. He had not been documenting a conquest. He understood that now with a clarity that felt almost physical. He had been serving as the legitimizing witness to a transfer that needed an official record, needed the appearance of proper documentation, while simultaneously needing that documentation to be precise enough to seem authentic and incomplete enough to be permanently useless. He was the record. He was also the alibi. He turned to a fresh page, and he began writing, not the official record, but his own. Every name, every room, the crossed-out visitor who had been dead for 14 months, the official with the unidentified list, the map room, the correspondence archive, the 40 years of private visitor logs being quietly processed by men whose identities he had never been given, the object, the directive number, the destination that did not exist. He wrote quickly. He did not know how much time remained. Then he heard footsteps in the corridor. There is a chronicle, contemporary to these events, written by a source with direct proximity to the Abbasid court, that provides the most granular surviving account of the administrative activity inside the palace in the days immediately following the conquest. It names figures. It describes movements. It records, with unusual specificity, the transfer of particular categories of document and material. By the standards of 13th century historical documentation, it is extraordinarily precise, and for that reason it has long been treated as one of the most reliable primary sources on the fall of Baghdad. The section covering the third day after the conquest ends on a half sentence. Not a damaged sentence, not a faded one. The text simply stops, mid-clause, mid-thought, and the next page is absent. The manuscript's own binding structure shows the physical evidence of deliberate removal, the fold pattern, the thread spacing, the parchment edge. A page was taken out. Scholars examining the manuscript in the 20th century noted this and, working from ink oxidation patterns on the surrounding folios, dated the removal to within decades of the original composition. The page was not lost to time. It was removed while people who understood what it described were still alive. This chronicle, in the version that has circulated for over 700 years, has never been presented to a general audience with that absence acknowledged. The standard citations treated as complete. The half sentence is footnoted, when it is footnoted at all, as a probable scribal interruption. The missing page receives, in most scholarly treatments, a single line. One additional chronicle, independent, written in a different city, appears to quote briefly from this missing section. The quote runs to 11 words. It contains a grammatical subject and a verb. Something was being loaded onto a specific transport. The sentence was clearly building toward its object, the thing being loaded, the thing being moved, the thing the first chronicle was describing in its final moment before the page was taken, and that object, in every surviving version of every surviving source, is precisely the part that does not exist. Something was removed from Baghdad on the third day. The record of what it was has been missing for longer than most nations have existed. The scribe made a decision that history would never record. He had perhaps an hour, perhaps less. The footsteps in the corridor had passed. This time. He looked at the pages he had filled, every name, every room, the impossible visitor, the forged directive, the destination that existed nowhere, evidence of something that had no official shape, documented by the one man who had been positioned, deliberately, to see all of it without being told what any of it meant. He did not hide the pages. He did not attempt to carry them out of the palace. He took the filled sheets and interleaved them, carefully, methodically, between standard administrative entries in the official daybook. Logistics records, supply transfers, routine notations that no one conducting a targeted search would stop to read in full. He was betting that whoever came looking for his account would search for something hidden, not something filed. We do not know if anyone ever found it. His name does not appear in any subsequent record. Now step back. Look at the full shape of what the evidence describes. Not a military conquest that happened to be disorganized. A dual-track operation running simultaneously, one layer visible, one deliberately obscured. The military assault provided the temporal cover, while the world watched the walls fall and the fires start and the libraries empty into the Tigris. A second operation was already in progress inside the palace complex. It required advanced knowledge of the archive's layout. It required forged administrative directives formatted to Mongol standards. It required an erasure team with access to sealed records and sufficient uninterrupted time to work through them. It required a witness, the scribe, who would provide the appearance of legitimate documentation without understanding enough of the whole picture to interfere with it. And it required, afterward, that the official historical account, the one commissioned by the Mongols, written by Persian administrators in Mongol service, still cited in scholarship today, describe only the military track. Leave the second track visible only in fragments, in crossed-out names, in a half-sentence, in a page removed while the ink was still oxidizing. The central question, who gave the orders for those first hours and what were they sent to find, has one answer that the evidence keeps pointing toward, and it is not the answer the standard narrative offers. The orders did not originate entirely from outside the walls. The pattern of what was targeted, what was bypassed, what was documented and then systematically obscured, required someone who knew the palace from the inside. Someone who had already decided the Caliphate was ending, and wanted specific things extracted before the ending became official. The name crossed out in wet ink was not the Mongols erasing their enemies. It was someone within the court erasing themselves, using the chaos of conquest as cover for a disappearance that had been planned before the siege began. If this video made you question what else in the historical record has been quietly filed between the routine entries, subscribe. Every story on this channel is built from the gaps that official history decided not to explain. Within 50 years, the narrative of Baghdad's fall had solidified into the form we still inherit. The Mongols received their story of overwhelming force. The Abbasid legacy received its story of noble, if futile, resistance. The Islamic scholarly tradition received a catastrophe that was explicable, political failure, military unpreparedness, the inevitable collision of a declining empire with an unstoppable one. Everyone received a story. Every story had the same missing page. The survivors who documented these events most closely, including Ibn al-Fuwa, the young librarian who lived through the siege and wrote extensively afterward, share a peculiar quality in their most specific accounts. They grow less detailed the closer they approach the third day, not vaguer due to distance or time, deliberately quieter, as if each of them, in the act of writing, reached the same invisible boundary and chose, for reasons none of them recorded, not to cross it. In the surviving daybook fragments, there is one name that was never struck through. Not in the real-time erasures, not in the retrospective ink strikes, not in any subsequent copy or edition. It appears in the visitor log for every single day of the Caliphate's final 2 weeks. It appears on the day after the fall. It appears in the same handwriting, the same ink, on a date 3 weeks after al-Mustasim was dead. No historian has been able to identify whose name it is. No researcher has established why it was protected when everything around it was being unmade. We know only this. In a system specifically designed to erase names, one name survived intact. And in that system's logic, the only names that survived were the ones held by the people operating the erasure. Whoever it belongs to, they were not a victim of what happened in Baghdad. They were its architect. And for 700 years, in plain sight, in a document that has always been considered incomplete, their name has been sitting there, uncrossed. Waiting.